Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning into today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you are watching me from YouTube or on Rumble. I would just like to kindly ask George if he has headphones, because I think there is an echo happening now. Do you have any headphones, George? I would just give you all the time to do that. Don't worry. So, welcome, guys, to Syriana Analysis. We are going to discuss very interesting topics today in this live streaming, and it's going to be mostly about Ursula von der Leyen's statements regarding Russia and her re-election as the head of the European Commission. I see that in the comments below, she doesn't really have much popularity among you, and you are really not a big fan of her. Personally, I'm not a big fan of her, but I'm not here to insult her. I'm just here to criticize her policies and criticize the confrontational policies that she is pursuing against Russia or China or against my country, Syria, for example, because it's very important, in my opinion, to cooperate and collaborate between these countries instead of pushing for warmongering policies. I would just try to see if George. Hi, George. I think it's now doing great. George Szamuely is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. He is the co-host of the Gaggle and author of Bombs for Peace: NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. It goes without saying, guys, all the links of George's X account is in the description below. His podcast, The Gaggle, is in the description below. And also, if you want to purchase his book, all the links are in the description below. George, I appreciate you for dedicating this time and coming to Syriana Analysis. I hope you're doing well, and life is treating you also well in Budapest as an intellectual who has the audacity to challenge mainstream narratives, and you're in a better position than I am in Berlin.
Yeah, I guess so. It's Hungary is a kind of island of freedom in Europe, and there is a freedom to debate here and a freedom to challenge conventional views of the world.
But it has the worst reputation here in Berlin. They call it a radical right wing, an extreme right wing, and they're intolerant toward the policies they're trying to promote in the European Union, right?
Well, that's right, and that goes without saying for most of contemporary Europe, which is that they identify Hungary with all these terrible things. They're anti-LGBTQ, and they're anti-immigrant. But the worst sin of all, the worst crime of all, is that they're against war, that they don't want to support the war against Russia, that they consistently have been calling for peace, for an immediate ceasefire. So this has earned Hungary this ridiculous title of Putin's best friend in Europe. And of course, Hungary is not in any way a friend of Russia. Hungary has never been particularly fond of Russia. The Hungarian government is basically pro-Hungarian and sees the ongoing war in a neighboring country, and Ukraine is a neighboring country, as something that will be detrimental to Hungarian interests the longer it goes on. And so that's why the Hungarian position, they say openly, it's pro-Hungarian. We just want this war to end. And in particular, because there are 150,000 ethnic Hungarians who live in Ukraine. And so Hungarians are obviously a little concerned about their destiny.
Yeah. When I started studying political science, this was in 2005, in the 101, we studied about what is called national interest, national security, and how the job of a politician is to secure the interest of his or her own people. And nowadays, this has become it's out of the discussion. There is something called more the European interest, and then we lose our national interest in this big basket of the European interest. And if a country like Hungary has wants to pursue its own policies, then they go against it. And they have all the means and the tools to fight against Hungary, right? And countries who want to pursue such a policies, because they have the money, they have the influence, and they have something called these NGOs. And they're spawning everywhere in the European continent. And they are basically, in my opinion, since the 90s, they're trying to indoctrinate the people and change the narratives in their minds, which leads into a change in political behavior and in electoral choices, right? So I would also always argue that there is social engineering happening in Europe, and it's not a natural development that the people are nowadays electing parties that are sending us to wars, for example, in Ukraine or against Russia, or they're trying to, what they say, it is not decoupling, but disengaging with China. It's always about confrontation, and it's been sold to the public as if it's the cute thing, it's a cute policy to pursue. And if you don't follow these policies, then you are a radical right wing. I found out myself that when I moved to Germany, that I'm a radical right wing as well.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's a very interesting situation that has been developed in Europe and to a certain extent in the United States, whereby democracy means the elimination of democracy. So the more you try to eliminate democracy, the more you eliminate free speech, freedom of expression, free debate, the more you're acting on behalf of democracy. And so when Orban, who wins election after election, he's now won 4 landslide elections. That's basically, I mean, anyone who tries opposing him has no mandate whatsoever in Hungary. He's always described in the media as a Hungarian strongman, Hungarian dictator, Hungarian authoritarian. So authoritarian leaders in the world, such as Viktor Orban. Well, how do you get to be an authoritarian if you win elections? And that's what's really happens here. So you get what you mentioned about these NGOs. Now, these NGOs are foreign finance. They're lavishly funded by the European Union, lavishly funded, obviously, by the George Soros network. But there are others. I mean, they just spring up, like mushrooms after a rain. I mean, you just can't keep tabs on all of these NGOs who are in the business of promoting democracy, promoting civil society, promoting free information, promoting the debunking of disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. These are all lavishly funded, and their goal is to eliminate democracy. And then, of course, you have this in the European Union, where you have this figure, this commissioner, Thierry Breton, who has taken it upon himself to eliminate free speech in Europe. I mean, that's his goal. He has said it openly. And that's being done in the name of freedom. I mean, doing it as free speech. So the more you eliminate things that Breton and the European Union leaders don't like to see, the more that's eliminated. So, maybe they'll get rid of X or Twitter. They say, well, that's in the name of freedom. Now we've got more freedom than before. So what that does is that it confuses the public. And of course, that's the whole purpose, is to confuse the public, because here we're talking about freedom. We're for freedom and democracy. Well, what do you complain about? That's my business. I'm trying to promote freedom. Yeah, but you're trying to eliminate it. No, I'm not trying to eliminate freedom. I'm just eliminating the things that are standing in the way of freedom. So if they overthrow a government, and they would love to overthrow Viktor Orban. I think that's why Orban is actually very strict about the activity of NGOs, because he knows that the whole purpose of bringing in these NGOs is to overthrow him. So when you overthrow governments, then that's being done in the name of democracy. So they say, we overthrew this a democratically elected leader. Yeah, but that was done in the name of democracy.
Yes. Actually, it's quite ironic nowadays how they are, in the name of democracy, suppressing the dissenting voices and even the electoral outcomes. Like when George Galloway was elected, and agree with him or disagree with him, that's completely something else. But when Sunak comes out and says that we have to protect our democracy, this was exactly what democracy means, or one of the factors of democracy, that the people elected him. And there was circumstances there were circumstances in the UK and the support of the UK government of the onslaught against the Palestinians, and there were forces capitalized on it, and they won the elections. I mean, instead of blaming themselves or trying to hold accountability of what they're doing, they always blame the outcome or the person who won in such an election. It's crazy. And nowadays we have Ursula von der Leyen. She has been nominated again for the post of the head of the European Commission for a second time. I mean, what does this tell us about the state of the affairs in the EU, especially with the allegations, corruption allegations against Ursula von der Leyen? And also, since Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, she's not the person in charge of the foreign policy of the EU, but she speaks in the name of the EU as if she is the chief of the EU's foreign policy, right? And I'm not finding any fine line nowadays between the American foreign policy and the European foreign policy. Where is the European foreign policy?
You're absolutely right. It's fascinating that she's the president of the European Commission, and she's at all of these meetings, you know, G7, G20, NATO, whatever the meeting is going, and she's there as the president. And she's treated as if she's the president of anything. She's a bureaucrat. She's an appointed bureaucrat. She's a political appointee. She's not the president of anything. And yet she goes around pretending that she somehow speaks on behalf of Europe. Now, you know, she gives the State of the Union. You know, the Europeans just blindly copied the American habit of the State of the Union. But, you know, again, whatever you may think of whoever the president, whether it's Biden or it's Trump, he is elected. He won an election. He's standing before both houses of Congress, who themselves were elected. Again, you don't like them, but they did have elections. Now, Ursula von der Leyen delivers the State of the Union as president. She's not president of anything. Before a European Union Parliament, elections that nobody takes part in. I mean, it's a joke how few people take part in these EU parliamentary elections. Now, she then proclaims that she somehow, foreign policy, she and Borrell. But to what extent, are Europeans really on board with this foreign policy? Well, they're not. I mean, we see in the protests of the farmers and, of course, the truckers, and that's throughout Europe, that they are very, very angry about this policy that has been pursued on behalf of Ukraine, which was it's not in the EU mandate. The people who are running the European Union did not run on the platform of we're going to give everything to Ukraine. The European Union is supposed to protect the workers in the EU, particularly the farmers. The common agricultural policy is the pride and joy of the EU. And the EU is doing nothing to protect them. They made a decision on behalf of Ukraine to lift tariffs on agricultural imports. So they're driving out of business the farmers, and they don't really care. Ursula von der Leyen comes along and she delivers speech after speech on behalf of Ukraine. So it's bad enough that she proclaims herself to be the president of Europe, which she isn't. But then she says that Europe must devote all of its resources to helping Ukraine, which isn't even a member of the European Union, not even a member of NATO. So what kind of a democracy is this? Of course, it isn't.
Yeah. She also, she didn't only copy the foreign policy approach, but also the military approach. And this is a video I want to show you, as if she's trying to create a parallel now military industrial complex, but the European one. And she says here, the European Union must launch the production of a new generation of weapons to win on the battlefield. This is what she said here. Take a look.
I can't hear what she's saying, but I know this speech.
Yeah, so she's saying we have to turbocharge our weapon production. It seems that there is a technical problem in this video, but apparently she is calling for the increasing or acceleration of the production of the weapon production in Europe in order to win on the battlefield. And when we speak about the battlefield, who is Europe against who Europe is going to fight nowadays? It's about this message is against Russia, right? And this is really increases my anxiety, because Europeans are going into suicidal mission against Russia in a war that they cannot win, and nobody can win. It's just mutually assured destruction of both sides. But the politicians nowadays, it's difficult to deal with the politicians, these decision makers in Europe. I was talking today with my wife, and I said, if I'm in Russia and I'm in a position of Putin or Lavrov, and I see the state of affairs in the EU, I ask myself how I'm going to deal with them, right? Because in my conventional political understanding, I know that if I meet Xi Jinping, how I'm going to greet him, how I'm going to speak with him, and when there is an agreement, I know that he's going to abide by the agreement. And if I meet the other president, let's say Assad, it's the same thing. But what I'm going to do with these Europeans, if they are themselves violating their own agreements with us, and now they are pushing for those more mongering rhetoric, right?
Well, exactly. There's no question. I mean, there's no point in even debating about it, that this war in Ukraine was triggered by NATO expansion. We've had years and years of warnings from Russian leaders that the more NATO moves eastward, the more threatened the Russians feel. We had this from Boris Yeltsin. Putin, from the start of his reign, has brought this up. We've had Western officials. We had, George Kennan saying, look, sooner or later, this NATO expansion is going to end in disaster. We had William Burns, who was ambassador in Russia, now is the current CIA chief, warnings that trying to bring Ukraine into NATO is a red line for Russia. He said this. He was ambassador in Russia at the time in 2008 when NATO made that promise. So you go ahead and keep doing this. You keep doing this and keep doing this, knowing that this is going to trigger a war. And of course, that's what NATO did. That's what NATO did this in order to provoke this war, because they felt that we can't lose either way. Because if Russia does nothing, then Russia ceases to be a great power, because now essentially it's going to be effectively surrounded by NATO states, because NATO is not going to stop with Ukraine. It's going to Georgia and then into Central Asia, then into the Far East. That's NATO. NATO's raison d'etre is continual expansion. NATO ceases to be a great power if Russia does nothing. If Russia gets involved in a war, well, then it's a war. And then Russia's got a real problem on its hands, and it does have a problem on its hands. It's a very difficult war. So that's what NATO was doing. It was a provoke. They keep saying Russia's unprovoked attack. There's never been a war in history that was as provoked as this one. And of course, you're absolutely right. If you're a Russian leader, why would you believe anything a NATO leader tells you? I mean, they've been lying repeatedly. Going back to James Baker's pledge to Gorbachev in February 1990, when he said not 1 inch to the east, to the promises that were made to Viktor Yanukovych that they would abide by the agreement that he signed on February the 21st with the opposition. That wouldn't be elected, that they would wait for an election in December of that year. Yanukovych was overthrown the next day. To the promises made at Minsk. And which again the Western leaders said, yeah, we never took them seriously. Why would anyone want to believe anything the West would say? I mean, if you were, I mean, you think that you're a very stupid person to believe that. I mean, like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3, 4, 5 times. I mean, that's bad business.
Actually, the other day I was hosting a discussion between Marcus Leboda and Martyanov, and there was a disagreement between them about whether Russia had a good faith in continuing in this agreements, or has a good faith in continuing the agreements with the European side or the American side, or it was a naivety. Because one of the individuals was saying that the Russians should have known that the Americans were not going to abide by these agreements, and the other side says you cannot deal with your opponents that way. You need to have a certain level of minimum of faith that the other side will abide by the agreements, right? On whose side are you in this? Like, do you think that the Russians were naive when they believed that Becker said, "Oh, we are not going to expand 1 inch to the east of Berlin"? I mean, it's not in an agreement; it was a promise, right?
Right. No, I have to say the Russians were staggeringly naive. Now, the point is that if you go back to the Baker-Gorbachev meeting, Gorbachev at that moment, in February 1990, still had cards to play, because he still had the Soviet presence in the German Democratic Republic, and as well as the Soviet military presence throughout Eastern Europe. Those Soviet forces were there legally. So if the Soviet Union wanted to extract concessions from the West, that was the time to do it, because you still had leverage, because he didn't have to move his forces out. He could have said, look, we are here legally. There's a 4-power agreement to divide Germany, and we're not going. We don't agree unless we get serious pledges for demilitarization, neutrality, and in other words, 50-year pledge that the members of the Warsaw Pact will not join any military alliance, 50-year pledge that NATO forces will not move into the territory of the German Democratic Republic, then we're not leaving. What are you going to do? How are you going to get us out? See, at that moment, the Soviet Union had the cards to play, because they could have said, well, what are you going to do about it? The problem that we have now is that it's NATO who's saying, well, what are you going to do about it? We keep pouring in weapons, more and more dangerous weapons, long-range missiles into Ukraine. And they're saying to the Russians, well, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to start a war against us? Well, Russia really doesn't want to do it. You're really going to use nuclear weapons? I mean, seriously, you're going to use nuclear weapons? Again, Russia obviously doesn't want to do it. So the point is, they can say, well, yeah, there's not much we can do. We can just simply sit back and allow NATO to get to throw in more and more weapons. Same way with, if we go back, let's go back to 2014 with Yanukovych. And, it was obvious. I mean, if you're a Russian leader and you're watching what's going on in the fall of 2013 and then 2014, it is obvious this is a NATO-engineered coup. They're trying to overthrow Yanukovych, who had won an election in 2010, promising to return to the 1991 pledge, which is that Ukraine will be neutral, it will not join any military alliance. That was, Ukraine made that pledge in 1991. Yanukovych said, we're going to go back to that. And Yanukovych did go back to that. The parliament passed legislation saying we're not going to attempt to join NATO ever again. So it was obvious what they were doing. I mean, they were watching this. They saw Victoria Nuland arriving there with the ambassador, handing out cookies at Maidan. What did the Russian leaders think that they were doing? Of course, they were trying to overthrow Yanukovych, because they saw Yanukovych as an obstacle in their plan to get Ukraine into NATO. So if I were Putin, I would say, look, to Yanukovych, you have to get on top of this. You've got to get your hands around this. You've got to crush this Maidan uprising immediately. If you don't have the forces, if the forces, you can't rely on them, then we'll supply you with the forces. But you have to finish this off. You cannot allow this to just go on and on. But instead, Putin agreed with Merkel, agreed with Obama. He said, well, everyone must exercise restraint. So he urged restraint on Yanukovych. But Merkel and Obama did not urge restraint on the people in Maidan. So Yanukovych was overthrown. That was an opportunity there. Any Russian leader would have known that this was being done in order to overthrow Yanukovych, overthrow a leader who was well disposed towards Russia, and replace him with a rabid Russophobe. That's what they were doing, and that was the moment when any responsible Russian leader says, whatever it takes, you have to crush this. If you can't do it yourself, we'll help you do it. So it's worse than naive. I mean, Russia's now put itself in a difficult position. I mean, it's a.
But how many times? How many times should this happen? I mean, I'm Syrian, but I'm ethnic Armenian, and when the color revolution happened in Armenia in 2018. And I have written about this extensively for the Armenian Republic, and especially for the Armenians who left Aleppo, where I come from, and they became refugees or migrants in Armenia, trying to tell them that there is a pattern here in Eastern Europe, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Armenia, in the spheres of influence of Russia, in the Caucasus, in the Eurasian region. And you can see that the way of the protesters can escalate their demands, and as much as you give them concessions, they increase the amount of the demands, right? It was so quite obvious for me that if back then Sarkisian leaves power and gives the authority to Pashinyan, this will eventually lead into alienating Russia, and then Russia will not be protective of Armenia in the security on the security side when Armenia is attacked by Azerbaijan. Armenia is sandwiched between Azerbaijan and Turkey, and the priority of the Armenians should be the national security before discussing all the other beautiful values that they want to import from the European Union, right? And of course, all dismissed, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're just a paranoid person, etc., etc. And in 2020, Azerbaijan conquered Nagorno-Karabakh completely. And I truly believe that Pashinyan, he is a fifth column, and he allowed it to happen in this region. And now he is alienating the CSTO. Also, he wants to kick out the Russian forces. And after all these things, they say why Russia is not coming for help. And I have a first-hand experience with the Russians in Syria. When they needed the help, they came for the help. Genuinely came for the help, but they expect you to be genuine and honest with them. Russians are completely different from like their mentality requires. They demand respect and they demand you to be honest and genuine with them. So
I agree with you. I should also say that Armenia's position now is very dark because Azerbaijan is now upping the ante. I mean, they're now saying, because of course, Armenia is, it's sandwiched between two parts of Azerbaijan, and now Azerbaijan wants to create this road, kind of the free passageway between the two parts of Azerbaijan. Armenia is not happy, but essentially it's going to cut Armenia off from Iran. Iran is kind of one of the few allies of Armenia. And now we have Aliyev saying recently that he regarded Yerevan as an Azerbaijani town. It's not a good situation. I mean, the sandwich between Azerbaijan and Turkey, they don't even have a border with Russia. Your one ally is Russia, and you've alienated Russia. I don't know. It's almost like a suicidal leadership that came to power in 2018.
Yeah, he's turning the country into pawn, actually, for the European Union and for NATO. And 2-3 days ago, I saw a statement for the bureau chief or the editor-in-chief of RT. She's also Armenian. And she said that in 5 years, Armenia will disappear from the map.
Yep.
And when Pashinyan was elected, they said similar things about Armenia, and they dismissed it, and they said this is Russian disinformation, Russian propagandist, etc., etc. But they know something about these cases, and they know that the Azeris and the Turks have immense power in that region, and the Russians are not in the mood to go into fight against the Azeris and against the Turks. But they can preserve the current borders of Armenia by having their forces there, right? The Turks and the Azeris are not going to come and fight against the Russians. And now the Armenian side is buying French weaponry. I mean, tell me more about how effective was this, all these European weapons in Ukraine. The lessons are in front of you. And this is very unfortunate. It hurts me to the core to see that Armenia is going to this direction. And they signed the ICC charter now, the Rome Statute, so that Putin cannot come to Armenia. They're just provoking the bear, in the Southern Caucasus. And now we have...
as you said, leaving the CSTO, that makes no sense. I mean, who's going to come to fight on your behalf? I mean, Iran, maybe, because Iran isn't very happy about having Azerbaijan essentially surrounding on its borders, Turkey and Azerbaijan. But Iran, Iran doesn't like to fight wars very much. So you've alienated Russia, and now you're relying on Macron. I mean, having seen what the French did in Ukraine, you're really going to rely on them? I mean, it's absolutely insane, this policy.
Yeah, and similar to what's happening in Europe, Armenia, they call it a democracy now, right? But if you criticize Pashinyan too much, you will be beaten up in the street. Masked people will come and kidnap you. You will end up in jail. You will be interrogated. It's similar things happening, and they call it but democracy in the name of protecting democracy against the national security threat. Von der Leyen says, I hope this video has a volume now. Just let me know if the volume works for this, because she says Putin sacrificed the country to save himself, and she vowed to hold him accountable, and the courtroom is already waiting for him in The Hague. Let's see if this volume is working.
No, it's still not working.
So she says Navalny sacrificed himself to save Russia, right? And then she says that, but Putin sacrificed the country to save himself, and there is a courtroom waiting for him in The Hague, and because of the war crimes that, or the alleged war crimes that he committed in Ukraine. And this is, in my opinion, a really sensitive issue, because the provocation, the diplomatic provocation, the legal provocation that they are waging against Russia, I feel like they are already on the edge. There is no way back now from this. Like Russia, I don't see in the next 10 years or 20 years dealing with Europe again.
No, I think that's right. I'm not sure which courts she's referring to, because the international,
ICC.
Yeah, the ICC. Now the ICC, of course, Russia doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of the ICC. Ukraine also, incidentally, doesn't recognize the ICC, but it's not a signature to the Rome Treaty. But what Ukraine did was very cute. They said, well, we will recognize ICC jurisdiction for anything that happened after 2015, in order that they can then bring charges against Russia. So that's why the ICC has got itself involved. But of course, it's really disgusting, because of course the ICC issued an arrest warrant against Putin, even though they had absolutely no evidence that Putin had committed any war crimes, because they hadn't done any proper investigation. And of course, now yesterday they issued a couple more arrest warrants against Russians. Now, Karim Khan, has done nothing in Gaza. Not only has he done nothing. Remember, the Palestinians are a party to the Rome Statute. They actually joined the ICC, and they've done nothing. Whatever has been done for the Palestinians, and that's been, I think 2015. I can't remember the exact year. So quite a while ago since the Palestinians have accepted the Rome Statute, and Karim Khan has done nothing. He went to Gaza. Didn't just sort of flapped his arms around, talked about October the 7th, and talk about the heavy moral responsibility on him, as the leader of the world community, the usual blather these people spout.
He posted on X. He said he's highly concerned about the
situation.
He's
highly concerned. Yeah, that's right. He's very, very concerned. Like European leaders like Biden, they're all very, very concerned. The terrible humanitarian disaster. They just don't know what to do. They're so upset about it. But he's done nothing. So remember how quick he was, or his predecessor, Moreno Ocampo, who was the ICC chief prosecutor over Gaddafi. Within weeks, he issued an indictment against Gaddafi. Remember, Gaddafi was the one who was actually under attack. So NATO attacked Libya. And what's the first thing the ICC does? Well, it issues an indictment against Gaddafi. But here, Gaza is just feeling terrible. No indictment. And of course, there aren't going to be any indictments. I mean, that we know this. It's pure theater.
And one of the cases, sorry to interrupt you, that was raised against Gaddafi in 2011, it was a report that says that Gaddafi is using Viagra and then rape as a weapon against the protesters. And then it turned out completely false and fake news. Now they're doing similar atrocity propaganda in Gaza.
Well, exactly. And you're right, because this is always a staple of wartime propaganda, which is the rapes, the sexual abuses. I mean, we had this, of course, in the war in Bosnia during the hysteria over Bosnia in the 1990s, when they began with all this propaganda about the mass rapes. The Serbs were raping Muslim women en masse. So, and they came up with these ridiculous numbers, 200,000 women have been raped. They just made it up out of whole cloth. And of course, there was never any evidence for it. But the media love these kinds of stories because, of course, well, it has, rape, people always look at that. And you're absolutely right. We've now seen the case of Gaza. Again, there was no evidence for it. And now we had this, the media again ran with this United Nations report the other day. Oh, United Nations find rape took place. Then, of course, when you read the fine print of the report, well, they never talked to any of the alleged victims.
No.
This was an entirely Israeli propaganda. They went there, they went to Israel, they got the usual spiel from the Israeli officialdom, but they never actually talked to the purported victims. But the media nonetheless said, oh, well, the UN has, determined that there was a mass rape had taken place. The UN had made no such determination because they weren't in any position to make such a determination because they didn't have any of the evidence. So all of this was made up by the Israeli propaganda machine, which is quite effective. The media have regaled it. And it's again based on a lie that the United Nations has confirmed it. The United Nations didn't confirm it any more than the United Nations confirmed the mass rapes in Bosnia 30 years ago.
There is something, these organizations must enjoy credibility. And the credibility is not only in the eyes of the governments, because the governments can be biased, and they are always biased, but in the eyes of the public. And I remember, for example, two examples. In Syria, for example, there was the chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017, and the OPCW didn't send investigators to go and pick the samples, but they sent the white helmets to pick the samples for them. And everybody knows the white helmets, they are an MI6 arm in Syria. Secondly, there was the report from the Amnesty International. They say in the prison of Saidnaya in Damascus, Assad executed 12,000 prisoners. This is a huge number. They say it's between 5,000 and 12,000. Like the numbers are like 5,000 to 12,000. You have 7,000 people, right? And then I'm a journalist, and I would like to see the sources, right? Because this is a huge allegation against Syria. And you go to the methodology, you go to the references, you go to the sources. All of them are unknown activists who are speaking to the Amnesty International in a neighboring country, Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, and they don't want to reveal their identity because they fear that their families will be persecuted by Assad in the country. But sorry, when you make such a big allegation and 12,000 people you say were executed by the Assad regime, you have to show me the evidence, because otherwise you lose credibility. And all these international institutions are losing credibility nowadays of what they call the rules-based order. And we're seeing a complete shift in the people's mood, especially after the Gaza war. And I'm happy to see many of the younger generation are waking up to the fact that the media is not telling them the truth about what's happening there. And this will influence positively on my country and other places.
Well, you're right. And of course, that story about these 12,000 executions, and that was, based on dubious, completely ridiculous evidence. And then it was pushed by Jeffrey Nice, who was the British lawyer who was at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He then kind of created a tribunal for trying crimes of the Chinese against the Uyghurs. Again, totally bogus kind of tribunal. So, there's a kind of incestuous relationship between all of these tribunals and courts and ICTY, Tribunal of the Uyghurs, and they're always taken as authoritative sources. So Jeffrey Nice, he's now Sir Jeffrey Nice. He's been knighted as if he's somehow some distinguished jurist. No, he's a political hack. And the British, of course, are really on the forefront. Wherever it's just like the white helmets, they were created by the British. They're always at the forefront of all of these things, largely because they speak very nicely. They have very nice accent. Jeffrey Nice speaks beautiful English, and they add a little bit of class to the operation. Because if it was the Americans who were running it, well, everyone suspects the Americans. I mean, it's just it. I mean, around the world, no one believes anything the Americans say. But if it's the British, then well, maybe there's some credibility. That's why when, if you recall, when Obama in 2013, when he was about to launch a bombing of Syria, they crossed the red line. So, and then what caused him to stop? Well, because they have a vote in the British Parliament, and David Cameron foolishly allowed the MPs to vote. The MPs said, no, we don't want to be a part of this bombing of Syria. And then Obama got cold feet, because without having the British there as a kind of, the fig leaf, well, it's our allies. The allies are pushing us. So they always do this. The Libya attack. Well, we were being pushed. The British and the French. They were doing it. We kind of had to follow them. We didn't really want to do it, but they did this. So Obama now suddenly, without having the British, with their nice accents, called it off. Now Trump, when you talk about the 2017, the bomb, he did bomb Syria. And he got the British there, British involved. Yeah. Theresa May was on board, but Theresa May was smart enough not to put it to the MPs. You never want to have democracy. You never want to put it to the vote, because if they're going to vote, they're going to say, no, we don't want any part of this.
Yeah. In 2013, when Obama said that the red line was crossed, the Brits actually, they had an intelligence in Ghouta, and they collected the sample of the sarin. And there was a chemical attack in 2013, and it killed 1,400 people, right? And when they collected the samples of the sarin and they tested it in the UK, they found out that this is not from the stockpile of Syria. So they shared this intelligence information with the Americans, and they said, pull the brakes. This is not Assad. It seems that we're being played in
right.
Syria.
Obama, yeah, you're right. I think Obama, had a conversation with Brennan. I think it was Brennan who told him it's not a slam dunk. But I don't know. But the MPs who voted, did they know about this intelligence?
They shared this information with the MPs, and actually they found out that this came from Turkey. Erdogan's side, they supplied these materials to the rebels. It was highly likely a false flag attack, and it doesn't. You don't need to be so genius to understand this was a false flag attack, because what happened is 6 months earlier there was another chemical attack. Sarin attack on Syrian army position in Aleppo. Yep. And the Syrian government called the UN and said, please come and investigate what's happening in Syria. And it took them 6 months to come to Syria, right? And they arrived in Syria on the 18th of August, right? And they rested on the 19th. They took all the necessary, certificates so that they can go. They need to see the military convoy that is protecting them. So they did all these logistical details. On the 20th, they wanted to go to investigate what happened in Aleppo 6 months earlier. On the same night, a chemical attack happened on the suburbs of Damascus, where the investigators are in Syria, 10 kilometers away from their hotel. So they aborted the mission. They didn't go to Aleppo. And they said, now we have to go and see what's happening in Ghouta. And everybody said this is the Assad regime. It doesn't take a genius to understand that they completely killed the investigation, because they would have been exposed that the first chemical attack that happened in Syria was against a Syrian army position used by these so-called rebels. And now they have an access to such materials, but they refused it. And we had Seymour Hersh exposing all these allegations against Syria. I've been following these cases a lot. I have zero confidence, George, in what the media says. Zero. Like if they say something, and if they say something and stand on the opposite side, I always know that I have 99% chance to be on the correct side, and my information would be correct.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that is, you have to say that's a great feature of the information revolution, because even 30 years ago, let's say at the time of the wars in Yugoslavia, most people just simply had the newspapers to go on. I mean, you didn't really know very much. I mean, the internet was just about getting on its legs, but most people just didn't know. So, yes. The media would report, the Serbs did this, the Serbs are mass killers, they kill thousands of people, they rape tens of thousands of women. And so, okay, well, maybe that's what they're at. I mean, where else are you going to go? You can't pull crap like this off these days. I mean, that's why I think there's just so much more information available. And I think that's why much of the mainstream media are falling into disrepute, because it's now so easy to show up what the mainstream media is up. And the case of the rapes is in Gaza is well, all the rapes in Israel by Hamas. It's a classic case. You could have pulled that off 25, 30 years ago. You could have pulled it off. Oh, Hamas used rape as a weapon when they attacked Israel. Jewish women were sexually abused. This is the worst crime against the Jewish women since the Holocaust. You could have got away with it. But, you know, you were able to bring on, you know, whether it was the Gray Zone or Electronic Intifada or Mondo Weiss, and they quickly exposed, you know, who were the people who were putting this story out. And they interviewed some of the victims' parents, and suddenly it was always shown up to be a nonsense. And the New York Times had to beat a hasty retreat, at least for a while, but then they're back at it this week by saying that somehow the United Nations has confirmed what the New York Times had reported in that big, you know, whatever 10,000 word story.
Yeah, I think one of the authors of the New York Times was faced a few days ago about this report, and he said he was asked if he saw any forensic evidence, and he said, no, this is not my job as a journalist to do it. And I remember the New York Times was in 2018. They published an article called the Duma chemical attack and augmented reality. Like they literally created a virtual reality scenario that how Assad used this chemical weapon and he dropped it from a helicopter. And every evidence shows that cylinder that they were put by hand over the building.
I remember that picture when you put the cylinder right on top of a bed. You know, it was a bed, unmade bed, and there was a cylinder.
He slept that cylinder over the bed, and he didn't break that bed. It was so ridiculous, the amount of propaganda. That's why I really appreciate the work you do, George. It's very important to fill this vacuum, intellectual vacuum, and being critical is important, even if you are not always correct. But being critical of the mainstream narratives, pushing back against the narrative is important. We need to have a balance. Unfortunately, in this, I truly genuinely believe that we are heading toward a dystopian world nowadays, especially in Western Europe. And if Ursula von der Leyen says that the biggest threat facing humanity is misinformation and disinformation and not wars, then I take that statement seriously, and I would like to protect myself. Like, when I do live streamings like this, I'm being careful what I say and what I shouldn't say, because it's not as free as they claim.
No. There's a real threat when they talk like this. Also, von der Leyen and that Thierry Breton, they're going to come after you. I mean, we saw with COVID. COVID was a kind of a dry run for what they really want to do. You know, this is what they really want to control the flow of information. And how do you do it? Well, you say it was disinformation. It's just Putin's propaganda. You know, you know, we have the right to close down Putin's propaganda machine. So it's quite easy to do. There'll be people protesting, but it's relatively, you know, easy to do. They did it with COVID. They can do it at any time.
Exactly. George, thank you so much for joining me today on Syriana Analysis.
Thank you very much. I hope, Kevork, that you'll be able to join us on the Gaggle with Peter and me.
I'm ready. Really, just send me an invite, and I will join you guys. Already, his podcast is in the description below, and his X account, and also his book. If you want to purchase the book "Bombs for Peace: NATO Humanitarian War in Yugoslavia," wink, wink, of course. And if you want to support also my independent work, there are different means in the description below, and I will see you tomorrow, Friday at 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you. Salam.